Look at the bar of soap sitting next to your sink. It costs less than a loaf of bread. It has no warning label, no danger about it, no story that anyone bothers to tell. And yet that plain little bar has quietly saved more human lives than every doctor, every army, and every medicine that came before it. For almost the entire history of your species, it did not exist. Not for the hunter crossing a frozen plain 200,000 years ago, not for the farmer in the first mud brick cities, not even for the emperor lying in his warm marble bath. So here's a question you have probably never asked yourself. What did ancient humans actually do before soap existed, and how on earth did anyone ever figure it out in the first place? Stay with me, because this story goes to some genuinely strange places. Before the end of this video, you will know exactly how the first soap was born, why it took the world 5,000 years to trust it, and how a simple bar of fat and ash ended up changing the fate of the entire human race. And there are 3 moments coming that are honestly hard to believe. First, an ancient empire that taxed human urine and used it to whiten teeth and wash clothes. Second, a doctor who begged the world to wash its hands and got locked away for saying it. And third, a hill of ash and fat where soap was supposedly born, the very same hill that a famous cult film about soap would make legendary 2,000 years later. If a story about grime, genius, and a bald man named Tyler Durden sounds like your kind of thing, subscribe and settle in. We are going all the way back to the beginning, to a river, a smell, and a secret. Step into the body of a human 40,000 years ago. You wake at dawn on the edge of what is now southern France, near the limestone caves of the Dordogne. Your skin carries the work of yesterday. Ash from the fire, dried blood from the hunt, the salt of old sweat. You do not think of any of this as filth. You think of it as warmth and as food. No soap, no shampoo, no deodorant, and somehow your species will survive long enough to invent all 3 and then complain about the price. Still, your body is far from helpless. Your ancestors learned long before you were born that a cold river cuts grease from the skin, that fine sand scrubbed hard along the arm carries away what water alone leaves behind, and that certain leaves crushed in the palm turn into a slippery foam. That foam is your first real clue. Plants like soapwort, horse chestnut, and the inner bark of some trees hold natural compounds called saponins. Rub them between wet hands and they lift oil and dirt in almost exactly the way true soap will one day do. And here is the wild part. Half a world away, people who would never meet found the very same trick on their own. In ancient China, the crushed pods of the soap bean tree made a cleansing lather. In India, the retha nut and the shikakai pod washed both hair and cloth. Across the Americas, the root of the yucca and the soap tree the Aztecs called copalzacatl did the same job. Long before anyone wrote down a single recipe, humans on every continent had already discovered that nature hides soap inside living plants, and quietly started using it. The old cartoon of the filthy, reeking caveman is mostly a lie we tell ourselves to feel modern. Archaeologists who study the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, including researchers like Christina Warrener, have shown that early humans often carried cleaner mouths and steadier skin than we imagine. Their food left far less sugar behind than a single can of soda does today. The bacteria living on their bodies sat in a rough, natural balance. Their sense of smell adjusted to a world with no perfume, so a scent that would knock you backward today was simply the ordinary smell of a living person. You oiled your hair with animal fat to keep it from matting. You chewed the frayed end of a soft twig to scrub your teeth, a habit that survives as the miswak stick still used in parts of the world. You rubbed fragrant crushed herbs on your skin, and you scraped yourself clean at the water's edge with sand, ash, and smooth stone. Grooming was not vanity. Picking dirt and insects from another person was how our ancestors said, "I trust you, and I am staying close." Your ancestors went further than water and sand. Fine-toothed combs carved from bone and wood, some of the oldest grooming tools we have ever found, were made to drag lice and their eggs out of hair, which means head lice have been annoying human beings for as long as human beings have had hair worth combing. The Neanderthals, your close cousins, boiled birch bark down into a black, sticky tar, and there is real evidence they used it on their teeth and skin, a natural glue with mild cleaning and healing power. All across the ancient world, people painted their bodies with red ochre, an earth pigment that may have shielded the skin from sun and insects, while it also marked who belonged to which group. None of this was soap. All of it was a species flatly refusing to sit in its own filth and give up. You were born into a body that already knew 100 small tricks for staying alive and staying tolerable to the people sleeping beside you. Now travel forward in time to the first great cities, to the towers of Mesopotamia, around 2,800 years before the Common Era. Here, on a small clay tablet pressed with wedge-shaped writing, someone recorded a recipe that still survives to this day. Fats boiled together with ashes. This is the oldest written formula for soap that has ever been found anywhere on Earth. And yet the people of Babylon were not lathering their hands with it before dinner. They used this mixture to clean raw wool and cotton before dyeing, and to treat sores on the skin. The idea that a person would one day rub soap on their own body simply for the joy of feeling fresh was still thousands of years away. Somewhere across the centuries, a man named Tyler Durden is nodding because he already knows how this story ends. Follow the trade routes down into Egypt. Around 1550 years before the Common Era, a long medical scroll now known as the Ebers Papyrus described mixing animal and plant oils together with alkaline salts to make a paste for washing the body and for treating skin disease. The Egyptians also gathered natron, a natural salt scraped straight from the beds of dry desert lakes. With natron, they cleaned their skin, preserved their food, and prepared their dead for the tomb, which means the same substance that freshened a priest in the morning also helped turn a pharaoh into a mummy. A temple priest might wash himself 4 or 5 times in a single day. For the Egyptians, cleanliness was never about comfort. It was a way to make yourself fit to stand in front of a god, and standing before a god with yesterday's sweat on you was not an option. The Egyptians turned cleaning the body into a whole beauty industry. They lined their eyes with dark coal, which looked striking and also helped shield the eyes from glare and infection. They chewed small balls of myrrh and honey to freshen the breath, an ancient breath mint made 3,000 years before the modern one. Wealthy women were said to bathe in milk and honey to soften the skin, a habit later attached to the legend of Cleopatra herself. And at their feasts, guests wore cones of scented fat on top of their heads that slowly melted through the evening, releasing perfume down the hair and shoulders, which was either the most elegant idea in the ancient world or the greasiest, depending on how you look at it. Sail across to ancient Greece, where washing became almost a sport. In Homer's Odyssey, written down around the 8th century before the Common Era, the Princess Nausicaa takes the royal laundry down to the river, treads the clothes clean in the water, and lays them out to dry on the shore, which tells you the Greeks were still scrubbing cloth by foot and by hand. In the gymnasium, athletes coated their bodies in olive oil, worked up a heavy sweat, and then scraped the whole mixture of oil, dust, and sweat off their skin with a curved bronze tool called a strigil. That gray paste they scraped away even had a name, gloios, and here is the truly strange part. People collected it and sold it as a medicine, believing the sweat of a champion could heal. So somewhere in Greece, you could buy a jar of a wrestler's scraped off filth and rub it on an injury and call it healthcare. So what is actually happening in that ancient bucket when fat meets ash? Here comes the first rule of soap, the rule every ancient culture stumbled onto entirely by accident. When you burn wood, the pale ash left behind holds a harsh salt called potash. Soak that ash in water and pour off the liquid, and you have just made lye, a solution strong enough to sting your skin and dissolve grease on contact. Mix that lye with animal fat and warm it gently over a fire, and the two do far more than simply blend together. They rearrange, at the level of tiny molecules, into something completely new. Chemists today call this reaction saponification. The fat and the lye become soap, along with a sweet, slippery liquid called glycerin. Nobody in the ancient world understood a single word of that chemistry. The real first rule of soap is that for thousands of years, the people making it had no idea they were making it at all. They only knew the result, and the result kept appearing in the same 3 places: where there was fat, where there was ash, and where there was falling water. And here is why that strange new substance actually cleans, a trick so clever it almost feels like cheating. A single molecule of soap has two ends that want opposite things. One end loves water and rushes toward it. The other end cannot stand water and buries itself into oil and grease instead. So when you wash, thousands of these little molecules swarm around every speck of grime, their water-loving ends pointing out, and their grease-loving ends dug in, and together they pry the dirt off your skin and carry it away down the drain. Grease on its own simply laughs at plain water because oil and water refuse to mix. Soap is the peacemaker that forces the two to let go of each other. Every ancient maker who ever boiled fat with ash was quietly building that tiny, two-faced molecule by the millions, with no idea at all that it existed. The Romans told a story to explain it, and it is a story you may already half know. On a hill they called Mount Sapo, animals were burned as offerings to the gods. Fat dripping from the roasting meat mixed with the wood ash of the altar fires, and when the rain came, it washed that pale, greasy paste down the slope into the clay banks of the river below. Women kneeling there to wash clothes noticed something they could not explain. In that one muddy spot, the cloth came clean far more easily than anywhere else along the water. Historians are almost certain the tale is a legend, because no such hill has ever been confirmed. And yet it holds a real truth about how soap keeps being discovered. If that image of soap, born from ash and the fat of the dead, on the top of a hill sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact story Tyler Durden tells in the film Fight Club, where a homemade bar of soap becomes the whole symbol of the movie. The screenwriters did not invent it. They reached back 2,000 years and borrowed a Roman legend, because fat and ash, touched by water and time, really do become the thing that cleans. The first soap and the first rule of Fight Club were both, in the end, about the same bar. Rome itself, strangely, was slow to wash the actual body with soap. Inside the enormous public baths, a Roman would oil the skin and scrape it clean with a strigil, then move between hot rooms, warm rooms, and cold plunge pools, treating the whole thing as the social hour of the day. The writer Pliny the Elder, who died in the year 79 of the Common Era while Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, wrote in his Natural History that soap, which he named Sapo, was an invention of the Gauls to the north. It was made from tallow and ash, he said, and used at first to give the hair a bright reddish tint rather than to clean the skin. So the earliest fans of soap in the Roman world were essentially using it as hair dye. About 100 years later, the physician Galen was among the first writers to firmly recommend soap for washing the body and cleaning wounds, and slowly, the bar began its long journey from the laundry basket and the hairline over to the skin. And now the first of those three promised moments. If soap was still catching on, how did Romans get their clothes truly white? The answer is human urine. Roman laundries, run by workers called fullers, collected pee in large pots left on street corners for the public to fill, then soaked and stomped the laundry in it, because urine breaks down into ammonia, and ammonia is a powerful cleaner. It did not stop at clothes. The poet Catullus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, openly mocked a man from Spain for grinning too much, because that man brushed his teeth with his own urine to whiten them, a habit some Romans genuinely believed in. And when the Emperor Vespasian placed a tax on the urine collected from public toilets, his own son complained that the money was disgusting. Vespasian is said to have held up a gold coin and asked whether it smelled. That is where the old Roman saying comes from, money does not stink. So yes, an empire taxed pee, brushed teeth with it, and washed its togas in it, and still somehow looked down on everyone else as barbarians. And since we are already standing in the least glamorous corner of Rome, we may as well finish the tour. Roman public toilets were long, stone benches with round holes cut into them, sometimes 20 seats in a single row, with no walls and no privacy at all, where senators and slaves sat shoulder to shoulder and talked about the day. To clean themselves afterward, many Romans shared a sea sponge fixed to the end of a wooden stick, rinsed between users in a channel of running water or a pot of vinegar. That communal sponge on a stick may even be the origin of the old saying about getting the wrong end of the stick. So the next time you grumble that your bathroom has run out of a certain roll of paper, remember that for centuries the height of Roman comfort was one shared sponge and a quiet hope that the person before you had rinsed it properly. When Rome finally fell, much of Europe let this hard-won knowledge slip through its fingers. The living centers of science and learning shifted east. In the cities of the Islamic world between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries, chemists turned the making of soap into a craft that came close to a true science. They combined pure olive oil with a lye drawn from the ash of a soda-rich desert plant, added lime, and boiled the mixture slowly until it set into a hard bar that could be cut into blocks, stamped with a maker's mark, and stored for years without spoiling. The physician Al-Razi, born in Persia around the year 854, wrote about soap and washing in his medical books with real care and precision. Cities like Aleppo in Syria and Nablus in Palestine grew famous for a firm green soap made from olive and laurel oil, a soap still cut and dried by hand in those same places today, more than 1,000 years later. For the first time in history, soap looked, felt, and smelled like the bar you would recognize now. Soap was only ever half of the story. The other half was the bath, and much of the world turned bathing into an art form long before Europe did. In the Islamic world, the public bathhouse, the hammam, became a center of daily life, a place of heat, steam, and rough scrubbing, where a visitor was worked over with a coarse mitt called a kessa before any soap ever touched the skin. Far to the east, Japan built a whole culture around the hot bath, from the natural volcanic springs called onsen to the neighborhood bathhouses called sento, where a person washes and rinses completely clean before ever stepping into the shared soaking water, a rule of order still followed today. In China, written records describe washing hair and cloth with the ground pods of the soap bean tree and with scented herbal powders more than 1,000 years ago. So while parts of Europe were busy learning to fear water, half the planet was soaking in it quite happily, and had been for a very long time. Crusaders and merchants carried these fragrant bars back into Europe, where soap slowly returned as a rare luxury for the very rich. The towns of Marseille in France, Castile in Spain, and Venice in Italy built whole industries around fine soap made with olive oil, guarded by strict local laws about exactly how it could be produced. And for a good while, medieval Europe genuinely loved to bathe. By the 13th century, towns across the continent were full of public bathhouses, known in England as stews, where people soaked in warm water, ate, drank, played music, and gossiped for hours, sometimes a great deal more merrily than the local priest would have liked. The city of Paris alone counted dozens of them at its peak. For a couple of centuries, a trip to the bathhouse was one of the real pleasures of ordinary life. And then the plague arrived, and the warm water drained out of the whole idea. Because right when things were finally looking up, Europe did something spectacularly foolish. During the great waves of plague, many physicians decided that warm water opened the pores of the skin and let disease slip inside the body. So the wealthy stopped bathing almost entirely and drowned themselves in perfume instead. The solution to smelling bad, apparently, was to smell overwhelmingly of something else. Bold strategy. Kings and queens went months between baths and thought nothing of it. Queen Elizabeth I of England was said to take a bath once a month whether she felt she needed it or not, and by the standards of her court, that made her a clean freak. When soap finally did sell, rulers smelled money. In England, a heavy tax on soap was placed in the 17th century and was not fully lifted until the year 1853, which kept a proper bar out of the hands of the poor for generations. Let me pause and say the quiet part out loud, because this is where the story turns. For thousands of years, the cure for a shocking amount of human suffering was sitting right there in a bucket of fat and ash, and the smartest people alive kept walking straight past it. That is the second rule of soap. The thing that can save you is usually the humble thing you refuse to take seriously. Hold on to that, because we are about to watch it break a good man's heart. Here comes the second promised moment, and it is the one that should make you angry. In the year 1847, in a busy hospital in the city of Vienna, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In one maternity ward, new mothers were dying at a horrifying rate, many times higher than the mothers in a second ward just down the same hallway. Semmelweis studied the puzzle for months. In the deadly ward, the doctors walked in to deliver babies straight after examining the bodies of the dead, and they did it with unwashed hands. He ordered every one of them to scrub with a solution of chlorinated lime before touching a patient. The death rate in his ward collapsed from around 18 women in every 100 to close to 2 in every 100. He had the proof written out in plain, undeniable numbers, and the medical world of his day refused to listen. The suggestion that respectable, educated gentlemen were carrying something invisible and deadly on their own hands insulted them to their core. Semmelweis was mocked by his colleagues, pushed out of his position, and he died inside an institution in the year 1865, still certain he was right, and still ignored by almost everyone who mattered. He was not alone in that fight, even if it felt that way. In London in 1854, a physician named John Snow traced a deadly cholera outbreak to a single public water pump on Broad Street, proving that filth and disease traveled together through what people touched and drank. Around the same time, during the Crimean War, a nurse named Florence Nightingale scrubbed her military hospital from top to bottom, insisted on clean hands, clean water, and clean sheets, and watched the death rate among wounded soldiers fall dramatically. The evidence was piling up from every direction. And then, 19 long years after Semmelweis first begged his colleagues to wash, the French scientist Louis Pasteur proved to the world that tiny living organisms, germs far too small to see, are what truly cause disease. The German doctor Robert Koch nailed the case shut. Only then did washing the hands become an iron law of medicine, and only then, after his death, was poor Semmelweis finally proven right about everything. After that hard turning point, soap at last became something every human on earth could hold in their hand. The Industrial Revolution made it cheap enough for a working family to buy without a second thought. Companies learned they could sell far more than a bar. They could sell fear and hope together. In 1884, the Lever brothers in England wrapped and branded a bar they called Sunlight, and sold the daily habit of cleanliness to millions. Pear's soap filled magazines with paintings of glowing, clean children. A brand named Lifebuoy practically invented the whole idea of body odor as a social crime you needed to buy your way out of. Preachers thundered that cleanliness was next to godliness, and the advertisers happily agreed, for a price. Soap even became a soft weapon of empire, sold across the world as proof of who counted as modern and who did not. The thing that was once free at the edge of a river was now a glowing pink bar in a paper wrapper, and you were made to feel that your worth was printed on the label. Here is the joke that writes itself. Fight Club spends 2 hours screaming that you are not your job, you are not your bank account, and you are certainly not the neat little products in your bathroom, and it chooses a bar of soap to carry that whole message. Meanwhile, the real history of soap had done the exact opposite for 100 years. It had taught millions of people that they were only as good as how clean and how sweet-smelling they could afford to be. Still, let us be fair to the little bar. Cheap soap genuinely transformed ordinary life, and it did the most for the people history usually forgets. For thousands of years, the endless, aching work of scrubbing a whole family's clothes clean by hand at the river and the wash tub had fallen mostly on women, day after day, in cold water, with raw and cracking hands. Cheap soap meant cleaner homes, cleaner wounds, and far more babies surviving that dangerous first year of life. For all the guilt the advertisers packed into the wrapper, a simple bar of soap in every home was one of the quiet reasons that people in the modern world slowly began to live so much longer than their own great-grandparents ever had. Then came the final test, and soap passed it in front of the entire planet. Soap was tucked into the kit of nearly every soldier in the world wars, because a clean wound and a clean pair of hands quietly saved more men than most weapons ever managed to take. And in the year 2020, when a new virus swept across the whole world in a matter of weeks, the single most repeated piece of advice from every doctor alive was not some rare and costly miracle drug. It was 20 seconds of scrubbing your hands with that same humble bar, made in that same humble way, fat and alkali turned into soap, in a process almost unchanged since the clay tablets of Babylon 5,000 years before. The reason it works is beautifully simple. That grease-loving end of the soap molecule tears apart the oily shell that wraps around many viruses, and once that shell is ripped open, the virus falls to pieces on your hands and rinses harmlessly away. A 5,000-year-old idea, fat cooked with ash, was still one of the single deadliest weapons the modern world could throw at a brand new disease. Ignaz Semmelweis, if he had been watching, would have wept. So think one last time about that story on the hill. The third of our 3 moments now come full circle. The first soap, born from fire, fat, and rain, found by pure accident, then forgotten, feared, taxed, advertised, and only at the very end truly understood. There is a hard little truth buried inside it, the same truth that made a movie about soap into a warning about the modern world. The things that people own so proudly, the perfumes, the marble baths, the branded bars with clever names, quietly came to own them, while the real answer to so much sickness sat waiting in a plain bucket of fat and ash, ignored because it seemed far too humble to matter. That, in the end, is the true first rule of soap. The thing that saves your life is very often the thing you walk straight past without a second glance. So look again at that bar of soap sitting next to your sink. It still costs less than a loaf of bread. It carries 5,000 years of accident, genius, filth, fear, and stubborn proof pressed into one small block you will use tomorrow morning without a single thought. And for almost the entire history of your species, no one who ever lived had held anything like it in their hand.